How do you establish what's really happening on the ground in an active war zone, inaccessible to international investigators? With so many horrific videos and photos out of Gaza, how do you piece together the whole truth and separate fact from fiction? I'm Anelise Borges, and this is The Stream. Israel has been accused of committing war crimes, even genocide, in Gaza. But without access to the territory, these allegations are hard to investigate. That's where so-called open source intelligence, also known as OSINT, comes in. Researchers analyze publicly available information, images, satellite imagery, databases to get a little closer to the truth, one photo, video, or data point at a time. Here to discuss this with me are two open source researchers, Lawrence Abu Hamdan, the Director of Investigations at Earshot, an NGO that uses audio forensics to investigate human rights abuses, and Chris Osieck, who regularly contributes to organizations like Bellingcat, a group that specializes in fact-checking through open source intelligence. Thank you both so much for joining us here on the stream today. But before we begin, let's have a look at what an open source investigation actually looks like. This one is by the New York Times and examines one of Israel's deadliest attacks on Gaza so far, the October 31st bombing of a dense neighborhood in the north of the Strip.
نتحدث عن مجزرة كبيرة بعدد كبير من الشهداء داخل مخيم جباليا.
يا عم هنا في 100 واحد في الدرج لحالها. هذه لحالها طلعت.
Lawrence, I guess the question here is, in a place as inaccessible as Gaza at the moment, how crucial is open source intelligence to get to the truth of what's happening on the ground?
Well, it's vital because, as you said, we do not have access on the ground. But it's also sometimes what is being recorded is not just the significant moments. It's what maybe at the time you might deem as insignificant, but later become a crucial part of investigation. Yeah. And I can give you an example from our own work. When we were looking into the Israeli strike on a group of 7 journalists in South Lebanon on 13th of October, it wasn't necessarily the explosion that was caught on camera that was so vital to what we could, how we could intervene in that case. But it was the 40 minutes of recording beforehand while they were setting up the cameras, adjusting the tripods, hooking up the microphones. They had incidentally recorded 40 minutes in advance of that explosion. And in that 40 minutes, we had the sound, a clear sound of a UAV, or what's commonly referred to as a drone. And we could tell from the undulating frequencies of that drone that it had circled that location 11 times prior to the explosion. And from being able to reconstruct that, we really could be confident in asserting that the Israeli Air Forces had sufficient information that these were journalists and civilians and not a military target that was that they were striking. And so, like I said, as much video as we can get, and sometimes what people deem to be insignificant video is the most vital part of an investigation.
It's very interesting. Chris, you also conduct OSINT investigations. Where do you begin? How do you go about sifting through information and analyzing it?
I personally always start with a location. So I start to see where something took place, and then afterwards it's important to see when something took place, to put things in a chronological order. In one example recently, actually on a car was striked in which IDF claims that it was solely a Hamas member that they struck. But it actually, when looking at the civilian media published also on social media, you also saw that children were included. Connecting those dots from the location of the car strike towards the IDF footage and towards the hospital basically shows that it wasn't only one Hamas member that got struck, but it also had civilian harm.
It is, again, it is fascinating, the work that you guys both do. Lawrence, if I can turn to you again, your organization, Earshot, performed a sound analysis of one of the most talked about episodes in this war, the missile that hit the Al Ahli Arab Hospital in Gaza on October 17th. Can you talk us through that investigation and your findings?
Sure. I mean, our findings were published because we felt that sound represented in that case a stone unturned. What do I mean by that? Is that we're the only organization in the world that does sound analysis for human rights application and human rights research. We are filling a gaping hole in human rights research, which has made incredible advances in satellite imagery, in the analysis of spatial analysis and video analysis over the last years, but has really left half the story untold on the soundtrack. And I think governments and corporate entities have become quite sophisticated also at countering and preempting some of the visual and information that can circulate, but they're often complacent when it comes to sound, and that's often where we can intervene. And this was really a case in point where we weren't necessarily investigating exactly what happened, but the claims that had been circulated by the IDF. One, that a missile that struck Al Ahli Hospital came from the southwest, and the sound showed a high likelihood that that was not the case. And secondly, a wiretapped video, a wiretap that was circulated about two people talking about the explosion being responsibility of Islamic Jihad, we could show had a great deal of digital manipulation, effects had been added, and the dialogue was edited. And so it was more about showing that there was more to this story, that people were lying or misleading when it came to the uncovering of this event, and that was having a big impact in governments and people discussing this in parliaments. And we felt it was important that sound came forward as to provide a really comprehensive analysis of what had happened, and to really argue for not what happened, but that we need to pause before we come to such conclusions, and that we need to look at all the evidence, which must include sound, satellite, visual, and other forms of analysis, as well as speaking to witnesses on the ground before we come to and rush to the conclusions that were being rushed to at the time.
So not a final conclusion per se, but a very important element in this story. Earshot, together with Al Jazeera, also performed this audio analysis.
On November 11, the official Arabic account of the State of Israel posted a video on X claiming to be from a nurse speaking from inside Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza. The alleged nurse asserts she is sending a message to the world despite Hamas controlling the hospital. So she says, watch this.
But the world has to know what Hamas is making here. They're taking over the entire hospital. They're taking over the fuel, the medicine.
Lawrence, can you tell us a little bit more about this particular piece and this investigation?
Sure. So, you had asked the question also about how we go about verifying the material we get. Well, sometimes sound is the main tool for verification itself, and this was a case in point. We were trying to see if this video was real. As I said before, it's hard to tell from visual traces, but the sound left some big questions that needed answering. We did not conduct an accent test or an accent analysis. That's not what we do, though intuitively as an Arabic speaker, I can hear some phonemes that are incorrect pronunciation. But so, from the first listen, we could tell that there was something wrong with this video. what I began to look at was the explosions that could be heard in the background. And what we could see quite clearly when we started analyzing the sound is that the way that those explosions resounded were not consistent with the way her voice was resounding in that room and resonating. And so it started a process of analysis that could quite clearly show that the recordings of the explosion had been actually added and edited on. We could also hear clear edit marks where there were sudden cuts in the tail of the reverberation. So you can imagine it goes boom, and then suddenly it stops. That's quite unnatural. You would never expect something to sound like that. So, you know, it takes a very short time to put something like that together, but it takes a long time to prove that it's false, unfortunately, and a lot of resources go into that. A lot of time is spent. And so, yeah, that was a case in point where we could show that was manipulated to the extent that we felt it was an unreliable source of evidence. However, it had circulated massively before we got to it and the time it took us to do that work.
It is fascinating how fast it can actually be, something like that can be produced and spread, and then how difficult it is to actually come forward and produce proof that that is false. I would like to bring Lara Elborno into this conversation. She's a Palestinian-American international lawyer and co-host of the Palestine Pod. She's also known online as Gazan Girl. Lara, thank you so much for joining us here on the stream today. South Africa has taken Israel to the International Court of Justice for what it calls genocidal acts against Palestinians in Gaza. How important is open source intelligence that we've been discussing here in cases like this one?
Thank you for having me. So digital evidence can be extraordinarily probative as evidence of criminal intent and criminal action. And 3 months into Israel's genocide in Gaza, Israel, we know, continues to deny foreign correspondents entry into Gaza, except if they are embedded in the Israeli military. And the content of their reporting is approved by the Israeli occupation itself, much less denying access to fact-finding investigators. So we know that in order to find out what Palestinians are actually going through on the ground in Gaza, we have to turn to the Palestinian journalists who for over 90 days now have recorded thousands of photos and videos of Israel's crimes in Gaza, showing Israel's targeting of civilians, including children, journalists, health workers, and more. And we know that despite the fact that these images almost never make it to corporate media, their existence is undeniable, and they're actually highly relevant to a court which may be charged with assessing Israel's compliance with its international obligations.
And that was my next question. Does this kind of evidence, OSINT evidence, actually stand up in court? Do institutions like the International Criminal Court or the ICG in The Hague take the work of OSINT researchers actually into account?
Yes, they absolutely can, and they have in the past. And even in this current moment, we are seeing open source intelligence evidence, digital evidence in general, being submitted to these institutions. So take, for example, South Africa's 84-page petition before the International Court of Justice, arguing that Israel is in violation of its obligations under the Genocide Convention. In the 574 footnotes contained in that document, South Africa has built a case of relying in part on evidence gathered online. For example, a good number of the over 60 statements of genocidal intent, which are referenced in that document, come from the tweets, the Facebook posts, and the Instagram posts of the Israeli government officials themselves. South Africa has also relied on a testimony of a Palestinian doctor that was posted on Instagram in its petition. And we know that as for the International Criminal Court, they offer victims and NGOs and any interested parties in general, a digital evidence submission platform known as OTP Link, where they can actually submit statements of abuses suffered with relevant photographs and video evidence that the court may then take into account. Now, of course, whether the International Criminal Court will actually act to prosecute perpetrators on the basis of that information is a different question, given the growing critique of the court, especially with respect to its handling of Israel's crimes against Palestinians. But I just want to make I'd just like to make a final point here.
Of course.
And that is that we have seen very troubling videos of Israeli soldiers posting TikToks, posting on social media in general, of them committing crimes, burning down civilian homes, blowing up entire neighborhoods in Gaza, posting videos of the aftermath, the rubble, firing grenade launchers onto houses and smiling, abusing detained Palestinians, and dedicating acts of destruction to other soldiers or their family members. And so this is actually very interesting to take note of from a legal perspective, because this means that a lot of the typical objections that may be formed against digital evidence, like credibility, trustworthiness, or authenticity, would not be able to be easily brought in this case, because we're seeing a tremendous amount of self-incrimination.
Very interesting point you bring. Chris Lawrence, I want to share a tweet with you posted by another OSINT researcher who says online disinformation about the Israel-Gaza war has led to an unprecedented surge in denial of atrocities and human suffering, including a notable rise in false claims of staged deaths, crisis actors, and fake victims. Chris, with so much content coming out of Gaza right now, the thousands and thousands of photos and videos circulating online, how big of a problem is misinformation?
A very big problem. I've seen in the past, actually in the beginning of the war, that a lot of old recycled footage was used again. Like it was one piece of video that I actually saw was from Beit Lahia in May. That was shared again as if it was now. And those are cases that I've seen like maybe not even once, but maybe like 5 times. Even recently, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, I saw a bulldozer destroying something nearby a hospital, and people were claiming that it was from now. Well, actually, it was from the raid happening in early July in Jenin. So old recycled footage paired with misinformation, but also with dehumanization, the Bollywood conspiracy theory, are really harmful and actually don't help at all.
There's obviously another side to this story, Lawrence. Open source intelligence is obviously not new, but the popularity of social networks have made it a hobby, even for people without training, without experience. Is that problematic per se, or not at all? Because the more information, the better.
Well, after the Ahli strike, we published our findings, and I think what's important for people to understand is that open source intelligence is not just open source because it gathers material that is publicly available. It's open source because it makes its own methods available to the public. It is as transparent as it possibly can be about how we come to our conclusions and why we're saying those statements. And that is to open ourselves up to peer-led critique, to sharpen our investigative skills in the public and before people, and so that there is a transparency around what we do. And I think if you're seeing things that are presenting themselves as expertise without giving the context and without really opening themselves up and exposing their own methods, then I think we should be concerned about that. And I was sent things personally by what I won't name the media organization, but a massive media organization, which asked me for comments based on a counter investigation of our own analysis of Al Ahli Hospital. And when I opened it, and this was threatened with publishing this counter investigation to show that we were incorrect, I found that this was a UFO enthusiast. What he said about the sound was completely wrong, and this was ready to be circulated without my intervention on a major news network. So I think there is a temptation with the kind of media circus around this, of people looking for content and giving equivalence to different kinds of expertise that they find online, when actually they should really look at the ways in which open source not only gathers its information but presents itself and presents its findings.
Lara, this is certainly one of the most documented wars in recent history. Is it fair to say that open source intelligence has somewhat revolutionized the global flow of information here. And are you hopeful that with so much information available now, there will be accountability, international accountability when it comes to Israel?
Well, I would definitely agree that open source intelligence, digital evidence in general, has certainly revolutionized the global flow of information. Now, as to whether I am hopeful that there will be any accountability in this case, taking, for example, the case before the International Court of Justice right now, I'm cautiously optimistic. The reason I'm cautious is because time and again, we have seen that the interpretation and enforcement of international human rights law and international humanitarian law be subject to political will, with powerful players like the United States and their allies excusing themselves from compliance while applying double standards and issuing hypocritical statements of condemnation when it comes to their enemies' violations. And of course, there's perhaps no clearer recent case than the U.S. approach to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which it has condemned in the strongest possible terms, while as it concerns Israel's invasion and occupation of Gaza, an occupation which I must remind has been ongoing now for 56 years, the U.S. has repeatedly gone on record in this current moment to state that it considers that there are no red lines for Israel, which is alarming and also false. There's actually many red lines. The entire legal framework of international humanitarian law establishes many red lines, which Israel is in daily violation of. So let's see what happens with the International Court of Justice. A finding of genocide could open the door to increased pressure for military, economic, and diplomatic sanctions against Israel. But in any event, none of these legal avenues, I would say, are a substitute for the continued pressure that the grassroots needs to continue to apply worldwide in order to hold Israel to account.
Chris, your take here when it comes to the role open source intelligence is playing in this war, and also your hopes for international accountability.
Well, I hope that it finally gives accountability, because it has been already going on so long, and there are a lot of people working it. I mean, there's a lot of pieces of footage that actually could serve as potential evidence to bring justice to it. What I do want to say is that there is some complications sometimes. Like, for example, yesterday there was a video shared by Middle East Eye of a woman with her child holding up a white flag, surrendering, and she actually got shot in the middle of Gaza City. Now, that's when something like what Lawrence does comes in, which is very handy, is you can really see whether it's the Israelis or whether it is maybe even somebody like Hamas. But you have to look at that when it's audio, maybe, to see what the distance of the bullet shot is towards the positions of maybe the IDF. So that's one thing of the complications that we're walking up against. A second one that I also want to say is that the mass destruction that has happened actually gives change to the environment, like how things look like in 2021, because you have very old satellite imagery available to you. It might not look like that right now. So things that are very straightforward to use, like a mosque, for example, or a reference point like a roof, may not be there, which makes it even more time consuming for us to collect that evidence and also verify it.
Absolutely. Lawrence, your take here, you've got the final word in terms of the role open source intelligence is playing in this war.
I mean, I'm encouraged by the South African case now in the ICJ. I hope that they will continue to look at evidence, the comprehensive set of evidence that's being produced around this and being documented. And sometimes we do our work not for now, not for the urgency of the now and for whatever news cycle is happening now, but for the future and for the long run. And we're hoping that even if we're overlooked now or some evidence that we produce is not maybe that it will matter in the future. And so it's with that we continue our work. It's not just for the immediate accountability, but for documenting this now for the future and to look back on this historically.
Lawrence, Chris, and Lara, thank you all so much for joining us here on the stream for this very important conversation. We appreciate your time. And thank you all, of course, for watching. Don't forget to stay in touch online, especially if you have a topic that you'd like to flag for us. This is very much your show. We're always open to your suggestions. You can use the hashtag or the handle AJStream, and we'll look into it. Take care, and I'll see you soon.